On an ordinary Tuesday morning in the small town of Westbrook, the sun shone brightly over the streets as the hum of daily life continued. The local diner, a staple for the town's working class, was bustling with activity. Servers moved swiftly between tables, offering cups of coffee and plates of pancakes to customers, who chatted idly about the weather, the local sports teams, and the latest gossip. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Among the regulars was the town's police chief, Lena Harris, who sat in her usual spot by the window. She'd been a part of Westbrook's police force for over 20 years, rising through the ranks from officer to the first female police chief in the town's history. Lena was known for her no-nonsense attitude, her sharp mind, and her unwavering commitment to justice. As the leader of the force, she had earned the respect of her officers, as well as the townspeople. Everyone knew Lena, and everyone trusted her. That morning, Lena was savoring her coffee, flipping through a stack of case files. She had just finished a meeting with the town council and was now preparing for a community outreach event that afternoon. It was shaping up to be another busy day, but as usual, Lena was prepared. She had learned long ago how to juggle the demands of her job with the responsibilities of her personal life, balancing both with a calm efficiency that made her seem invincible. As she sipped her coffee, Lena caught sight of a man walking into the diner. He was a regular in Westbrook, though not one Lena interacted with often. His name was Officer Greg Marshall, and he worked in the department with her. He wasn't known for making waves, but his colleagues had whispered about his increasingly harsh and often inappropriate views on race and policing. Lena had brushed off the gossip, believing that everyone deserved a chance to change and improve, but something about Greg's demeanor that morning made her uneasy. Greg took a seat at the counter, not far from where Lena was sitting. She glanced up briefly, offering him a nod of acknowledgement, but didn't engage further. Her focus remained on the case files spread before her. However, Greg's presence in the diner wasn't entirely coincidental. He had been eyeing Lena for weeks, and today, he had come to act on a plan that had been brewing in his mind for far too long. Lena was unaware of the storm that was about to hit her. It started subtly. Greg's eyes lingered on Lena longer than usual. His gaze, once neutral, was now filled with an unsettling hostility. As the waitress brought him his order, Greg leaned in, speaking louder than necessary. "You know, it's funny," he said, addressing the waitress but looking straight at Lena. "They let anyone in charge these days. Even women." His words were slow and deliberate, laced with a venom that was hard to ignore. Lena looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. She had heard the comment but wasn't sure if it was meant for her. She gave him the benefit of the doubt, assuming it was just an offhand remark. However, Greg wasn't done. His voice grew louder as he continued, trying to provoke her. "I mean, it's bad enough we've got people like you, running things around here, but the fact that they let someone like her lead us?" He gestured with a mocking glance toward Lena, who now stared at him directly, her calm demeanor slowly turning into a sense of unease. Lena knew what was coming. She had dealt with racially charged comments before, both in and outside of the department, but there was something about this moment that felt different. Greg was a colleague, someone she had worked with for years, and yet here he was, making clear his deep-seated prejudice. He had crossed a line that could not be ignored. "Greg," Lena said, her voice steady but laced with authority, "you need to keep it down. This isn't the place for that kind of talk." But Greg wasn't backing down. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with an ear-piercing sound. "What's the matter, Chief?" "Getting a little sensitive," he taunted, stepping closer to her. His smirk was arrogant, almost as if he were daring her to react. The diners around them had fallen silent, some glancing nervously at each other, unsure of how to intervene or if they should even get involved. Lena felt her pulse quicken, but she remained seated, taking a deep breath. She was used to being the bigger person in situations like this. She had learned the hard way that leadership often meant swallowing your pride and letting things slide for the greater good. But Greg's behavior was escalating, and this time, she wasn't sure if it was something she could simply ignore. "Greg," she said, this time with more emphasis, "I'm going to ask you to leave if you don't stop." Her eyes locked onto his, her words clear and firm. She was not someone to be intimidated, and she made that very clear in that moment. But Greg didn't stop. Instead, he took another step toward her, the smirk still plastered on his face. "Oh, I'm so scared," he mocked, leaning over her table. He reached down, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her out of her seat with an unexpected force. The force of his grip stunned Lena for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Lena's heart raced, but she stood her ground, refusing to let this man physically intimidate her. She had dealt with much worse in her career, but this was different. This was a fellow officer, a man who worked beside her, a man who should have respected her. And yet, here he was, trying to belittle her in front of a public audience. She wasn't going to let it slide. Without a word, Lena used her strength to push Greg away, knocking his hand off her arm and stepping back. The movement was swift, calculated, something she had learned over the years in martial arts training and self-defense courses. But before she could fully react, Greg swung his foot, landing a hard kick to her side, knocking her back slightly into the booth behind her. The force of the kick sent a shock of pain through her body, but it didn't break her resolve. The diner fell into complete silence. It felt as if time had stopped. The patrons, frozen in shock, could barely process what had just happened. The reality of the situation hit everyone at once. This was no longer a simple disagreement between colleagues. This was a violent assault. Lena's mind raced as she tried to steady herself. She could feel the blood rushing to her ears, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. This was a breaking point. This was a moment that would define her not just as a police chief but as a woman who had to make an incredibly difficult decision in the face of aggression and disrespect. Greg, on the other hand, had no idea what he had just done. He stood there, chest heaving, a sneer still plastered on his face as he waited for her to react. He expected her to cower, to submit, as so many others would have done. But Lena wasn't just any woman. She wasn't the kind of person who would let herself be humiliated, not by anyone. And Greg, in his arrogance, had no idea what was coming. Lena rose from the booth, slowly and deliberately, locking eyes with him. The diner had become a stage, and everyone was watching. She felt a mix of anger and disbelief, but she didn't show it. Instead, her expression hardened into a look of determination. She stood tall, the weight of her badge on her chest, her role as a leader and protector of this community weighing heavily on her shoulders. Greg had crossed a line, and Lena knew she had to act. "You've made a big mistake, Greg," she said quietly, her voice low but firm. "A mistake you'll regret." Her words hung in the air for a brief moment before the realization set in. Greg had no idea that Lena was about to turn the tables on him in a way he would never expect. And that was only the beginning of what would become an unforgettable moment, not just for Lena, but for the entire town of Westbrook. The tension in the diner was palpable. Lena stood still, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of her steady breath. Her heart was pounding, not from fear but from the heat of righteous anger. For years, she had maintained composure in the face of adversity, had kept a cool head while her colleagues made insensitive comments, while people underestimated her based on her gender, her race, or both. But this time, something about Greg's actions, something about the way he crossed the line, was different. This time, it wasn't just a casual insult or a dismissive comment. This was physical, and it wasn't just about her, it was about the very values she had sworn to uphold as a police chief. Greg stood there, his chest still puffed out, a smug grin slowly creeping back onto his face as he looked at Lena. He was waiting for her to respond, expecting her to back down, as though he had some kind of power over her. His miscalculation was his first mistake, and it was one he would come to regret deeply. For a moment, Lena said nothing. She simply looked at him, her expression hardening as she weighed the gravity of the situation. In the past, she might have tried to de-escalate, spoken calmly, offered a word of reason. But not this time. Not after what he had done. Greg had just kicked her, a violent act that no leader, no woman, and no human being should tolerate. He had shown a complete lack of respect, not just for her but for every woman in this town who had fought for equal treatment, for every officer who had ever given their all for the badge they wore. Lena clenched her fists. It was time for action, not words. She took a slow, deliberate step toward him, her eyes never leaving his. The onlookers in the diner held their breath, watching the scene unfold before them as if they were witnessing a battle of wills. Some were whispering under their breath, unsure of what was happening, while others waited for the first move, unsure of what Lena would do. Greg, still standing, seemed to sense the shift in the air. He was used to getting his way. He had bullied and belittled enough people in his life to think that no one would ever stand up to him. But he hadn't been prepared for Lena. She wasn't just any person, she was the police chief. She had been trained for situations like this. More importantly, she had been tested in ways he couldn't imagine. Without warning, Lena struck. In a blur of motion, she reached for the nearest object, an empty glass bottle that had been left on the counter. She grabbed it with precision and swung it toward Greg's chest, knocking him back with enough force to send him stumbling into a nearby table. The loud crack of the glass hitting his ribs echoed through the diner. The force of the blow left him winded and confused. He had no time to react, no time to process what had just happened. Greg blinked in disbelief. He was still trying to comprehend the fact that Lena, the woman he had just humiliated in front of a room full of people, had just struck him. He looked down at the bottle, which had shattered on impact. The shards scattered across the floor, a stark reminder of the force behind Lena's actions. "Don't ever touch me again," Lena said, her voice low and steady, filled with quiet authority. Her words hung in the air, the weight of them settling over Greg like a storm cloud. The room had gone dead silent. The hum of conversation that had once filled the diner had ceased, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence that seemed to hold everyone in place. Greg, now breathing heavily, looked around the diner, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The people who had been too afraid to speak earlier now watched him with wide eyes, their gazes filled with a mixture of shock and awe. He could feel the shift in the room. The people who had once looked to him with some measure of respect were now looking at him with contempt. He was no longer the officer with power and authority. He was a man who had just been publicly humiliated by a woman he had tried to bully. Greg's expression twisted into a mask of fury as he lunged toward Lena, his hands reaching for her. But Lena was already 2 steps ahead of him. With the same fluidity she had demonstrated when he had kicked her earlier, she sidestepped his attempt to grab her. She had anticipated the move, prepared for it. With a swift motion, she grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back, using his own momentum against him. Greg let out a sharp grunt of pain as his arm was wrenched into an uncomfortable position. "You've just made another mistake," Lena said through clenched teeth as she tightened her grip. Her voice was calm, but the underlying anger was unmistakable. "You think you can come into my town, into my diner, and act like this? You're out of line, Greg. Completely out of line." Greg struggled against her hold, trying to free himself. His face was red, his muscles straining as he fought to break free, but Lena held him firmly in place. For all his size and strength, he was no match for her precision, her training. He was still trying to process the shock of being outmaneuvered by a woman he had just tried to humiliate. It was clear that he wasn't used to being in this position. In his mind, he was still the one in control. But Lena wasn't done yet. She wasn't finished making a statement. With one final twist, she forced him to the ground, her knee pressing firmly into his back as she pinned him to the floor. "You're done, Greg," she said, her voice filled with finality. The room was silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of the two of them and the faint hum of the diner's air conditioning. Lena could feel the eyes of everyone on her, but she didn't flinch. She was standing her ground. This wasn't just about Greg anymore. This was about something much bigger. The sheriff, who had been sitting quietly at a corner booth, stood up and walked over to them. He had been watching the entire altercation unfold. He had seen the way Lena had handled herself. With a slow, deliberate step, he knelt beside Greg, handcuffing him without a word. "I think it's time you took a little walk, Greg," the sheriff said, his tone cold but not unkind. He looked at Lena, who nodded slightly, giving him the silent acknowledgement that she didn't need to say a word to understand. The sheriff would handle the legal consequences. Lena had made her point. The onlookers, still in shock, began to murmur among themselves as Greg was led out of the diner. The tension in the air was slowly lifting, but the weight of what had just occurred would stay with everyone for a long time. Lena had faced down a man who thought he could get away with violence, with intimidation, and she had come out on top. As Lena watched Greg being escorted out, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. It wasn't just about the physical altercation, it was about standing up for what was right, about proving that no one, not even a fellow officer, could take advantage of her or the people she swore to protect. The town of Westbrook had just witnessed something that would change them forever. The way they viewed power, respect, and leadership would never be the same again. And for Lena, this moment would mark a turning point in her career, her life, and her community. She had shown them what it meant to stand firm in the face of injustice, to fight back when everything seemed stacked against you. She had earned her place, not just as a police chief, but as a leader who would never back down, no matter the cost. The next morning, the aftermath of the diner incident rippled throughout Westbrook like a tidal wave. Word spread quickly, as it often did in a small town, but this was no ordinary rumor. It wasn't just about a fight between two individuals, it was about the very foundation of power, respect, and the role of authority in the community. Lena's actions had become the talk of the town, from the local coffee shop to the barber shops, from the schoolyard to the police precinct. Everyone had something to say, but no one knew quite what to make of it. At the police station, things were tense. Lena walked into the precinct with a heavy heart. She had always known that her position as the first female police chief in the department wasn't going to be easy, but this was something entirely different. The morning shift was already underway when she arrived, and as she entered the building, every pair of eyes turned toward her. Some were filled with admiration, others with uncertainty, but most were laced with disbelief. They had all witnessed Greg's actions and Lena's swift retaliation, but now they were grappling with the reality of what it meant. She wasn't just a police chief. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who had the courage to face down violence, even when it came from within her own department. Lena took a deep breath and stepped up to her desk, not bothering to acknowledge the whispers and murmurs that filled the room. She had learned long ago not to let gossip affect her, but today, it felt different. Today, it was all about standing firm, about showing the world that she wouldn't back down, no matter the cost. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Sheriff Thomas, the man who had helped defuse the situation the night before. She opened it, her heart rate quickening. The sheriff had been kind to her, offering words of reassurance after Greg had been taken into custody. But this message wasn't about that. This was about the fallout from the incident. "We need to talk," it said simply. "Greg's making waves. There's talk of internal investigation. You should prepare yourself." Lena's stomach churned. She had known that Greg would not take this lying down, but to hear it from the sheriff made it real. He was a man of few words, and if he was warning her, it meant things were serious. The problem was, Lena wasn't entirely sure what she was walking into. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and what had started as a personal altercation was now becoming something much larger, something that had the potential to unravel the delicate balance of power in Westbrook. As the hours passed, Lena continued to wrestle with the consequences of the previous night. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how much was at stake. The people in the diner, the ones who had witnessed Greg's violent outburst, were now looking to her for leadership. They had seen her take a stand, but now they were waiting to see what she would do next. They wanted to know if she would back down, if she would bend to the pressure, or if she would continue to fight for what was right. The phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. Hesitant but resolute, Lena answered it. Lena, the voice on the other end was calm but firm. This is Chief Marshall from the State Police. We've received a report about an incident involving one of your officers. It's come to our attention that Greg had a history of aggressive behavior. We need you to make a formal statement. Lena's mind raced. This was serious now. State authorities were involved. What had started as a dispute between her and Greg was now escalating into something that could not be ignored. Greg's past actions, ones that Lena had been unaware of, were now coming to light. She hadn't known about his aggressive tendencies, but it seemed that others had. I'll cooperate fully, Lena replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. But I need you to know that this wasn't just about one incident. This is about the culture in this town, in this department. If there's anything to investigate, it's the underlying issue that has allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked for so long. The line went quiet for a moment, and Lena could hear the faint sound of papers shuffling on the other end of the call. We'll be in touch, Chief Marshall said before hanging up. Lena sat in silence for a moment, her thoughts swirling. She knew that this wasn't going to be an easy battle. She had taken on a man who was well-connected, who had a network of supporters within the department and the town. But now, things were bigger than just one person. This was about creating lasting change, about standing up to a toxic culture that had allowed inequality and violence to persist. The investigation would soon be underway, and Lena wasn't sure what the outcome would be. But one thing was certain, she wouldn't back down. She had faced down a man who had thought he could break her, and she had come out on top. She had made her point, but the road ahead was still uncertain. Lena knew she had to be careful. The backlash could come from any direction. As the first female police chief in Westbrook, she had always been under scrutiny. Every move she made was analyzed, every decision questioned. Now, with the investigation looming, the pressure was on. She could already feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. She walked out of the precinct and into the bright morning light, her mind set on the next steps. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was no stranger to hardship. She had risen through the ranks of a male-dominated department, fought against expectations, and overcome countless obstacles to get to where she was today. If this incident had proven anything, it was that she was more than capable of facing whatever came her way. Lena returned home that evening to find her inbox flooded with messages, most of them from her colleagues, some from local residents. They ranged from congratulatory notes to those filled with doubt and criticism. She didn't read them all. Instead, she went to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee, and sat by the window, staring out at the quiet streets of Westbrook. She had built her life on service, on doing what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Tomorrow, she would face whatever came next, but tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace, a moment to reflect on the battle she had already fought and won. The fight wasn't over, but Lena knew she was ready. She wasn't just the police chief anymore. She was a symbol of what it meant to stand up, to fight for justice, no matter the cost. The following weeks were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and press conferences, each one more intense than the last. Lena's world had shifted dramatically since that fateful night in the diner, and it felt like the entire town of Westbrook was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. The investigation into Greg's actions, and by extension, the entire police department, was now in full swing. The pressure weighed heavily on Lena's shoulders, but she never showed it. She had built her career on resilience, on her ability to stand firm when everything around her seemed to crumble. Yet, even Lena knew that this was different. This wasn't just about a personal dispute. It was about the town, its people, and the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. The fractures in the police department were now exposed for all to see, and it wasn't just Greg's actions that were under scrutiny. The culture of the force itself, its deep-seated issues with racism, misogyny, and unchecked aggression, was now being laid bare. The state police had taken over the investigation, but they were relying heavily on Lena's insight. She had spent years in the department, climbing the ranks, earning the respect of those who had doubted her, and forging relationships with people who could either support or destroy her. And now, those same people were being asked to speak up, to confront the realities of what had been happening behind closed doors. Some of them had been complicit in maintaining the status quo, while others were too afraid to rock the boat. But in the weeks that followed the diner incident, Lena knew that there could be no more silence. The first real blow came when a former officer, who had left the department years ago, came forward with allegations of racial profiling and excessive force under Greg's watch. The man, a black former officer named Marcus, had always been vocal about the department's problems but had never felt comfortable speaking up while still on the force. Now, from the safety of anonymity, Marcus shared his experiences. His testimony was raw, emotional, and damning. "I watched it happen over and over again," Marcus had said in an exclusive interview with a local news outlet. "We'd pull over black drivers for no reason. Search their cars without cause. And Greg? He was always the first one to escalate things. He was the one who'd put his hands on people, take things too far. I saw it firsthand, and I knew it wasn't right. But I couldn't say anything, not back then. And now, I regret every day I kept quiet." His words hit like a sledgehammer, and the town was rocked. The public's perception of the police department, of Lena's leadership, was on the verge of being shattered. Many people in Westbrook had always looked up to the police as an unshakable symbol of safety and justice. But now, that image was being questioned. Could they trust the officers who were meant to protect them? Could they trust Lena, the first woman to hold the position of police chief, to steer them through this storm? Lena knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. She had already faced resistance from some members of the force who had resisted the changes she was trying to implement. Now, with the public watching, she had to prove that she wasn't just a symbol of progress, she was the person capable of leading them through the storm. She had to take action. It was during one of the most intense press conferences that Lena's resolve was tested to its limits. Reporters, their microphones thrust toward her, were relentless in their questioning. They wanted answers, and they wanted them now. The community demanded justice, and they weren't going to wait for things to play out behind the scenes. "Chief Jensen, what do you have to say about the accusations being made by former Officer Marcus?" one reporter asked, her voice cutting through the tension. "Do you think the department has failed the community, and if so, what are you doing about it?" Lena took a deep breath. Her face was calm, but inside, she was boiling. She knew this question would come. She had prepared herself for it. But the weight of the moment was heavy, and for a moment, it felt like the world was watching her every move. "I take these accusations very seriously," Lena said, her voice steady. "And I am fully committed to ensuring that the department is held accountable for any wrongdoings. We will be conducting a thorough internal investigation, and any officer found guilty of misconduct will be held responsible. This is a moment for change, and I won't let this department, my department, continue to operate with a culture of corruption and violence." Her words were firm, but as soon as they left her lips, she knew they weren't enough. There was more to be done. Action, not just words, would determine her legacy. And for the first time since becoming chief, she began to realize that the change she had always dreamed of might come at a cost. Greg's supporters were not going to sit idly by while their ally was under attack. They began to rally against Lena, painting her as an opportunist, someone who was using the incident to further her own agenda. They claimed that Marcus' allegations were false, that they were part of an attempt to discredit the department and undermine its leadership. They accused Lena of overreacting, of tarnishing the reputation of good officers who had done nothing wrong. For weeks, the town was divided. The debate raged on: should they stand by their police force, or was it time to demand change? Lena felt the weight of this division, knowing that every decision she made could either solidify her position or tear everything she had worked for apart. She was no longer just the police chief. She was a lightning rod for every issue that had plagued the town for years. As the weeks turned into months, the tension in Westbrook grew. Protests broke out in front of the police department, with residents demanding that the department be overhauled. Some of the protesters were longtime friends of Lena, while others were strangers who had never met her but believed in the cause. And still, there were those who stood in defense of the police, insisting that the accusations were exaggerated or untrue. The town, once peaceful and close-knit, was now a battlefield of ideologies. Lena knew that change would not come easily. But she also knew that it was necessary. If the town was to heal, if the police department was to regain the trust of the community, there had to be accountability, transparency, and reform. She called for a public town hall meeting, a chance for the community to come together, voice their concerns, and take the first step toward healing. It was a bold move, one that could either strengthen her position or lead to further division. But it was the right thing to do. On the night of the meeting, the room was packed. The air was thick with tension as Lena stood at the front, facing a sea of angry, frustrated faces. But there were also those who were hopeful, who believed that change was possible, if only they could come together. Lena looked out over the crowd, her heart heavy with the weight of the moment. She stepped up to the podium, her voice clear and strong. "Tonight, we begin the process of healing," she said. "It won't be easy. But it will be worth it. We are all here tonight because we care about this town, about our community. And together, we can make sure that this tragedy, this moment of crisis, becomes the turning point for something better." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, there was silence in the room. It wasn't the silence of resignation, but the silence of possibility. Lena didn't know how this story would end. She didn't know if she could win back the trust of the town or if she would be forced to walk away from everything she had built. But one thing was certain: she had started something that couldn't be undone. She had begun the process of change, and there was no turning back. The town of Westbrook would never be the same. But perhaps, just perhaps, that was the beginning of something new. Something better. The days following the town hall meeting were a turning point for both Lena and the people of Westbrook. The meeting had sparked something profound in the town, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, of yearning for change but also fear of the unknown. The town had always prided itself on its sense of unity, but the recent events had torn that unity apart, exposing deep-rooted tensions that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Lena felt the weight of those divisions, but she also knew that this was her moment to lead the town into a new era, one that confronted the uncomfortable truths that had been buried for far too long. The aftermath of the town hall was immediate. The police department, already under intense scrutiny, was now forced to confront the very culture that had allowed the racism, the violence, and the corruption to fester for so long. Lena made it clear to her officers that they would not be allowed to hide behind the badge any longer. Those who were guilty of misconduct would face consequences, and the department would undergo sweeping reforms that would change the way they interacted with the community, the way they viewed their power, and the way they held each other accountable. But reform was never going to be easy. There were officers who, like Greg, saw Lena's changes as an attack on their authority, and they fought back with all the force they could muster. Some spread rumors about Lena's leadership, questioning her ability to lead a department that had always been steeped in tradition. Others quietly defied her orders, undermining her authority at every turn. It was a constant battle, one that never seemed to end. Lena had to pick her battles carefully, knowing that every misstep could unravel everything she had worked for. As the pressure mounted, Lena began to rely more and more on the support of those around her. She had her close allies within the department, officers who understood the need for change and were willing to help her bring it about. There was Officer Sarah Grant, a young officer who had been with the force for just a few years but had already proven herself to be a fierce advocate for justice. Sarah was one of the few who stood by Lena when others turned their backs. Together, they worked tirelessly to implement the reforms that Lena had promised the community. They attended meetings with local community groups, listened to the concerns of residents, and made sure that the voices of those who had been silenced for so long were heard. But despite their best efforts, the community was still divided. The protests continued, but they became more organized, more vocal. It was clear that some people wanted more than just promises, they wanted action. They wanted to see the results of Lena's words. And, more than anything, they wanted to believe that the police department could truly change. But there were others who were deeply skeptical, who saw the unrest as a threat to their way of life. These people, often in the minority, rallied behind Greg's supporters, insisting that the town's police force was not the problem. They accused Lena of betraying the men and women who had served with honor, of undermining their work and discrediting the department. It was in the midst of this turmoil that Lena received a phone call that would change everything. It was from the state's attorney general, who informed her that the investigation into Greg's actions was nearing its end. The evidence was damning, and it seemed almost certain that Greg would be charged with multiple counts of misconduct. But the Attorney General also had a question for Lena, a question that made her stomach turn. Chief Jensen, the Attorney General began, "We've looked at the entire department, and we're concerned about what we've found. There are other officers who have been involved in similar activities. We need your help in identifying them. We can't make any moves until we have a clear understanding of the full scope of this corruption." Lena's heart raced. She had always known that the department had its issues, but the scale of it, of what was hidden beneath the surface, was more than she had ever imagined. She had taken on the role of police chief with the intention of making things better, of creating a more just and fair system. But now, she was faced with a choice: expose the corruption that had seeped into every corner of her department, or protect those who had been complicit, knowing that doing so would allow the status quo to continue. The decision weighed heavily on Lena. She knew that revealing the truth could tear the department apart, but she also knew that it was the only way to rebuild it. The community had already lost trust in the police. If the full extent of the corruption came to light, it could destroy what little credibility they had left. But if she remained silent, if she chose to cover up the truth, she would be no better than the very people she was trying to hold accountable. The phone call ended, but Lena couldn't shake the weight of the decision she had to make. That night, she sat alone in her office, staring at the papers in front of her. The faces of the officers she had worked with for years flashed through her mind. Some of them, she knew, had been loyal, had done their jobs with integrity. But others had allowed the toxic culture to thrive, had turned a blind eye to the misconduct and abuse that had plagued the force for so long. It was in this moment of quiet reflection that Lena realized what needed to be done. She couldn't just confront Greg or any single officer. She had to take on the entire system, the entire culture that had allowed racism, violence, and corruption to flourish. She had to be the one to dismantle it, brick by brick, no matter the cost. The next morning, Lena called a meeting with the department's leadership. The room was tense as she stepped in, her mind made up. She could feel the eyes of her officers on her, some of them hopeful, others wary. But Lena wasn't there to appease anyone. She was there to do what was necessary. "I've made a decision," she began, her voice firm. We're going to conduct a full internal audit of the department. Every officer will be held accountable for their actions, past and present. Anyone found to have engaged in misconduct will be removed from the force. This will be painful, but it's necessary for us to move forward. We will not sweep this under the rug. The time for change is now. The room was silent. Some officers exchanged uneasy glances, while others sat with their heads bowed. Lena could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she stood tall, unwavering in her resolve. Over the next few weeks, Lena worked tirelessly, pushing the department to confront its darkest secrets. She met with community leaders, coordinated with the state police, and worked with her team to identify the officers who had been complicit in the corruption. The investigation was grueling, and the revelations were shocking. There were officers who had taken bribes, others who had used their position to intimidate and harass members of the community. But through it all, Lena never faltered. She knew that this was the only way to rebuild the trust that had been broken, the only way to restore the integrity of the police force. When the results of the investigation were finally revealed, the community was shaken. Several officers were arrested, and the department was forced to undergo a massive overhaul. It was a painful process, but it was also one of renewal. Lena had risked everything, her career, her reputation, her relationships, to ensure that the truth came to light. And while the town of Westbrook would never be the same, there was a sense of hope that had not existed before. The road ahead would be long, and there would be those who would never forgive Lena for the decisions she had made. But as she stood at the front of the police department, watching the officers who had chosen to stay with her, she knew that she had done the right thing. She had taken a stand, not just for the department, but for the town itself. And in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Lena Jensen had rebuilt the trust that had been shattered. And while the scars of the past would never fully fade, the future of Wes. The days following the fallout of the investigation were marked by a tense silence that seemed to hang over the town like a thick fog. For Lena, the weight of her decisions was both a source of pride and a heavy burden she could not shake off. The department was in shambles, with officers being arrested or removed from their positions, and the community, once divided, was now trying to reconcile with the aftermath. In the wake of the revelations, Lena found herself spending more and more time at the department, trying to restore the sense of order and structure that had been lost. But no matter how much she worked, there was a lingering sense of unease, a question that remained in the air: could Westbrook truly heal from this? It wasn't just the department that was fractured. The town itself was reeling from the revelations, struggling to find its footing in the wake of the scandal. The protests that had initially begun in the aftermath of Greg's violent attack on Lena had evolved into a larger movement, one that sought justice not just for Lena but for the entire community. People from all walks of life were coming together to demand change, to ensure that the kind of corruption that had plagued the police department would never happen again. But there were also those who felt betrayed by the process, who saw Lena's reforms as an attack on the town's identity, on the very fabric of what had once been a close-knit community. Lena knew that rebuilding the department would be a monumental task, but she also knew that she had to lead with unwavering conviction. The hardest part was not the public reaction, it was the private battles she faced with her own officers. While some had supported her from the start, others remained bitter, resentful of the changes she was pushing for. There were murmurs of dissent in the hallways, whispers of rebellion that seemed to bubble up every time Lena turned her back. She had expected resistance, but the depth of the animosity surprised her. The department had always been built on loyalty and tradition, and for many, Lena's changes were nothing short of an insult to that heritage. One morning, as Lena walked through the department's front entrance, she was met by Officer Sarah Grant, who had become one of her most trusted allies. Sarah had been with Lena through every step. Brooke was finally on a path toward healing of the investigation, and she had witnessed firsthand the emotional toll it had taken on the chief. Despite the external pressures, Sarah had stood by her, providing the support and encouragement that Lena needed to stay strong. I've been talking to some of the officers, Sarah said as they walked down the hallway. There are still a lot of them who don't get it. They think you're selling out, that you're going soft on the department. Some of them are talking about leaving. Lena sighed, her shoulders slumping as she leaned against the wall. I knew this was coming. I can't change everything overnight. But I have to keep moving forward. If I don't, if I let them control me, then this whole thing was for nothing. Sarah nodded. I know. It's hard, isn't it? I've never seen the department like this before. So many people are questioning everything they thought they knew. I don't think they're ready for the level of change you're pushing. Lena looked at Sarah, her eyes tired but determined. I don't have a choice. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about something bigger than all of us. But even as Lena prepared herself for the next wave of challenges, she was faced with an unexpected turn of events. One morning, she received a phone call from the mayor's office. The mayor, who had initially supported her when the scandal broke, was now wavering. There were whispers of the town council pressuring him to distance himself from the police chief. They were concerned about the continued fallout, about the reputation of the department and the town as a whole. Some even suggested that Lena's leadership was too divisive, that the department needed a fresh start, someone who could rebuild it without the baggage of the past. Lena listened carefully as the mayor spoke, but she could feel the shift in his tone, the hesitation in his words. He wasn't the ally she had once thought he was. She understood the pressure he was under, but she also knew that backing down now would be a betrayal of everything she had fought for. I appreciate your concern, Lena replied, her voice calm but firm. But I'm not going anywhere. I'm here for the long haul. If that means I have to rebuild this department from the ground up, then so be it. I won't stop until the job is done. The mayor didn't respond immediately, but Lena could sense his discomfort. She knew that her stance had created a rift between them, one that might never be healed. But she couldn't afford to worry about that right now. There was too much at stake, too much work to be done. In the days that followed, Lena faced even more resistance. A few officers who had been quietly disgruntled began to openly challenge her leadership, questioning her decisions and undermining her authority at every turn. There were even rumors of some officers actively trying to sabotage the reform efforts, hoping to see her fail. It was a brutal, exhausting battle, and for the first time since she had taken on the role of police chief, Lena wondered if she had made a mistake. But then she remembered the faces of the community members, the people who had come to her for justice, for change. She couldn't turn her back on them, not now, not ever. One evening, as Lena sat alone in her office, poring over the latest reports and working through the next phase of her reform plan, there was a knock on the door. She looked up to see Officer Sarah standing in the doorway, her face pale and serious. Lena, you need to see this, Sarah said quietly, holding up her phone. Lena's heart sank as Sarah showed her a video. It was a recording of a recent police encounter, one that had gone horribly wrong. The video showed an officer, not one of the officers under investigation, but someone who had been working alongside Lena in the aftermath of the scandal. The officer was seen using excessive force during a routine traffic stop, violently pushing a civilian to the ground. The video had gone viral, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the media. Lena felt her stomach churn as she watched the footage. It was a clear violation of everything she had worked so hard to build, and it came at the worst possible time. The trust she had been working so hard to restore was now hanging by a thread. She looked at Sarah, feeling a sense of helplessness she hadn't experienced since the scandal first broke. We have to act quickly, Lena said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. This is everything we've worked for. We can't let this derail everything. Sarah nodded, already pulling up a list of steps they needed to take. We'll get ahead of it. We'll investigate this and make sure the public knows that this isn't the new normal. But Lena knew that this video, this incident, was more than just another scandal. It was a reminder of how deeply entrenched the problems in the department really were. No matter how many reforms she put in place, there would always be those who resisted, those who saw her as a threat to their way of life. And it was clear that even in the face of such resistance, the work was far from over. In the end, Lena knew that the only way forward was to keep pushing. She had made a promise to the community, and she would not break it. The journey ahead would be long and painful, but it was a journey worth taking. And as she looked out the window, watching the sunset over Westbrook, Lena Jensen knew that the battle was far from over, but it was one she would continue to fight, no matter the cost.